And joining us now to break down the situation with Dr. Fauci is John Malcolm. He's vice president of the Meese Institute, Advancing American Freedom. Thank you so much for joining this morning, John. Can you explain how the presidential pardon from former President Biden may or may not be valid in this situation?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of things. So Joe Biden issued a blanket pardon to Anthony Fauci for anything he did as the government's chief virologist from January 1st, 2014 until the day Joe Biden left office, January 19th of 2025. So that would cover the entire time during the pandemic. But two things. One is a presidential pardon would only cover federal offenses. It would not cover any crimes that he might have committed in the states. And also the president and several Republicans, I don't think we're going to succeed in this, have challenged the validity of all of Biden's last minute pardons, saying it was really staffers who used President Biden's auto pen to sign these pardons without the president's awareness or knowledge that they were doing so. And of course, if a judge were to invalidate Biden's pardon, again, I don't think they will, but if that were to happen, then he could, of course, also be prosecuted by the Department of Justice for any crimes he might have committed during the time period covered by the pardon.
Yeah, the intrigue of the auto pen is certainly very interesting. I do want to move on, though, to the first point you made. Outside of the Senate, is Dr. Fauci expected to face criminal inquiries in other jurisdictions, as you mentioned, such as states?
Well, several states' attorneys general have announced now that they're going to begin inquiries against him. It's hard to know exactly what crimes they have in mind. One that occurred to me was that around the time that he was retiring, he gave a deposition in the case that ultimately went to the Supreme Court called Murphy versus Missouri. That deposition was given by the Attorney General in Missouri and also the Attorney General in Louisiana, who were involved in that case. And if he perjured himself during that deposition, then, of course, he could be charged with perjury by those in those states.
And then coming back to today's question on if he can invoke the Fifth or if he can't based on a pre-existing pardon, if he is compelled to give testimony and because the pardon isn't applicable and he gives that testimony, could that then be used against him in those state lawsuits? Essentially putting him in sort of like, I guess, a double jeopardy kind of situation.
Sure. Well, Congress would have to grant him immunity, or the House would have to grant him immunity. Not the easiest thing in the world to do, because under the House rules, it would take a 2/3 vote of the committee. It's hard to know whether the Democrats would play ball. But assuming that he was granted immunity, it would depend on the kind of immunity he got. If he got transactional immunity, that would mean that anything that he testifies about, so long as he testifies truthfully, he cannot be prosecuted for, any of the subject matter of that testimony. If he got what's called use or derivative use immunity, which is more likely, what that means is he could be prosecuted, but the prosecution could not use any evidence that was derived either directly or indirectly from his compelled testimony. Oliver North, you may remember, was compelled to testify in the Iran-Contra matter. He was subsequently prosecuted and convicted. He appealed that, and his conviction was overturned precisely because the prosecutors could not prove that all of the evidence that they had introduced against him was completely independently derived and not derived in any way from his compelled testimony.
Yeah, a very fascinating set of circumstances from a legal perspective. Now, it appears that there 100% could be ethical questions raised from Dr. Fauci's diary. And I'd be happy for you to summarize, in your view, what are some of the most shocking in your view, and also which you think might meet the criteria of a crime?
Sure. Well, there are several things that are embarrassing. He's saving all these fawning clips about him and discussions that he had with Hollywood glitterati about how great he was. Two things come to mind. One is that apparently in his diaries, he makes references to sending emails to people and saying, I'm going to destroy these emails and you should too. These are government records, and it is a federal crime to delete government or destroy government records. The other is that he had apparently a lot of his staffers doing research and then applying for him to win various honors that actually allowed him to pocket $900,000. And so there could be an investigation about misuse of government resources for obviously personal reasons and personal gain. There may be other crimes that he committed too, but those are two that readily come to mind.
And on that last point about using, requesting to be nominated for cash prize awards, if he is doling out government funds to those organizations for research grants, does that constitute any particular crime?
I'd have to look at the federal code to determine that, but it's certainly a conflict of interest to be able to be basically sitting there and saying, well, I'm going to determine how much money you get. How about you give some of it back to me? I suppose you could say that that is a bribe or a gratuity, but I'd need to study the circumstances. But that's possible. There's possible federal charge there, too.
Well, today we'll find out what happens in terms of this contempt of Senate charges and see what happens next. John Malcolm, thank you so much for joining us. Fascinating discussion.
My pleasure.